It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. Well, if the question was how much Mayor Mamdani and the Democratic Socialists of America showed their political muscle in the New York primary, the answer we now know is a lot. The three candidates Mamdani endorsed all won. You probably heard that much by now. But listen to this. Claire Valdez in the race to succeed Nydia Velázquez in Congress won by 20 points. Including by 10 points in Brooklyn over the Brooklyn Borough President, Antonio Reynoso. From the numbers I saw, nobody predicted that. Daria Liza Avila Chevalier beat incumbent Adriano Espaillat in Upper Manhattan and the nearby Bronx. Hardly anyone ever heard of her a year ago. That win is being compared to AOC's against Queens power broker Joe Crowley. Who remembers him anymore? But he was high up there in the Democratic hierarchy in Congress. That was back in 2018. And DSA candidates, also a little below the radar, but I think really important in New York. DSA candidates won 7 of the 8 New York State Assembly seats they campaigned for. That should increase the DSA headcount in the Assembly from 9 to 14 is the number I saw. We've invited some congressional winners to come by briefly this morning. We'll see if they're awake. I think we have at least one confirmed with us. First, our own Brigid Bergin, WNYC senior political correspondent, and Michael Lange, a New York City-based writer, researcher, strategist, and political organizer who, if you know his work, he does New York City political analysis, including electoral analysis, literally block by block. And he had a piece on his Substack the other day that predicted the outcome block by block. I know Michael will be transparent and humble about things he got right and things he got wrong. So, hey, Brigid and Michael, welcome back to WNYC.
Good morning, Brian. Great to be here.
Good morning, Brigid. Great to hear from you.
Nice to hear from you, too.
Brigid, just first a little color from you, because you were out reporting last night. Where were you? What was it looking like there as the results came in?
Sure. I was in Bushwick at the victory party for Claire Valdez, where I will note that Mayor Mamdani name-checked Michael Lange for all the great work he does looking at election turnout, down
wait,
to the...
Wait, we have that clip. Let's just play that clip, and then we'll pick it up from there. Here we go.
A year ago, it was not the end of a political movement. It was the beginning. And I want to thank you, because in this room, I see those who believed no matter what tweet they read from Michael Lange.
No matter what they read from Michael. Okay, Michael, you get the right of first response to that one.
Pretty surreal. I mean, again, as someone who has had the good fortune of knowing both Zohran Mamdani and Claire Valdez for many years predating this, to kind of see this all unfold is pretty remarkable, but not like terribly surprising as well. So no, that was funny. And I mean, again, Claire, I thought she'd eke it out the whole time, and she won by 20 points. I mean, just utter destruction. She was getting Mamdani-esque margins against not Andrew Cuomo, but Antonio Reynoso in places like Bushwick and Ridgewood. I mean, I think there was a lot of optimism about DSA winning most or a very good percentage of these races, but just the margins at which they were able to do so. Even the DSA candidates that Mamdani did not endorse won in landslides over like incumbents who had represented some of these districts for a long time.
Those were assembly races.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it wasn't just like 10,000 feet Mamdani versus Cuomo. Cuomo not having building a base or turning out voters in the district. I think it's incredible to be able to win at the macro scale, but when you can really win at the block level, it's remarkable. And I think this was a validation of Zohran's victory last year, but also the validation of a greater political movement that orbits him.
So your prediction in your Substack Monday was Valdez 48%, Reynoso 46%. As it turned out, she won by 10 times that amount, by 20 points instead of 2 points. It may be too early for you to have looked block by block, but as granularly as you can, what happened where?
I think, okay, to give myself a tiny bit of credit, I think if you look at the map that I posted, it was decently close to what it came out. But what was remarkable, though, was just the margin at which Claire Valdez won these other neighborhoods. And again, to just foreground all of this, the Satmar Hasidim in South Williamsburg and parts of Bedford-Stuyvesant, they were close to around 10% of the entire electorate. And they were voting for Reynoso 97, 98, 99%. So he basically started with 10% of the vote baked in, which is remarkable. So then to lose by 20, it shows that Valdez, really thoroughly crushed him throughout most of the district. In Queens, she had a very pronounced advantage. Of course, she represents Queens in the state assembly, but she also did super well in Brooklyn. It's just, as I've said, we've talked about this district as kind of the commie corridor. That thesis was undoubtedly cemented last night because, again, Reynoso, supported by the Working Families
And let me
Party,
just say to the listeners that you mean that lovingly when you say the commie corridor. That
there's
part
no
of
red baiting going on here.
Astoria,
No, for sure.
Long Island City, Ridgewood, Queens, right, where where Mamdani did really well in his part of that area. Obviously, where he came from his assembly district, et cetera. So go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted that reference to be clear for listeners.
That's a good interruption. Thank you. I don't want to be accused of red baiting when I say it lovingly. What was remarkable is to the extent that the Mamdani, the DSA coalition transferred from him to Claire Valdez, and it didn't really matter that it was Antonio Reynoso or Andrew Cuomo kind of on the other side of that. That's the thing. Antonio Reynoso, again, he represents these neighborhoods now as the Brooklyn Borough president. He's endorsed by the Working Families Party, supported by Nydia Velazquez, and none of it mattered. What mattered was that Claire Valdez had DSA and had Mamdani, and just the sheer volume and to get the margins that she did, it's not just overwhelming among voters under 50, but she had to also do quite well with voters over 50 as well. Just a thorough race. And, again, if I can, defend some of my logic, thinking that this was a little bit closer. Both campaigns, some independent expenditures, they had polling that showed that this was very tight. But I think similar to last year, though, the polling hasn't quite caught up with how young the voting base is becoming, particularly in these neighborhoods. So just a really remarkable result.
So, Brigid, pick up the Antonio Reynoso portion of that story, because as Michael was just referencing, and some of our listeners know this and some of our listeners don't, and maybe this is particular to a district like that and doesn't generalize to other places, but the DSA was so strong and the Mamdani endorsement was so meaningful that they bothered to run against Antonio Reynoso, the Brooklyn Borough president, who himself had a reputation as a big progressive, and as Michael just reminded us, had the Working Families Party endorsement, but the DSA went against even the Working Families Party in this race and won by that much. So talk a little bit about the Antonio Reynoso factor, where he came from and how he lost.
Yeah, part of what we saw here is someone who has been, arguably in the trenches for a while working in Democratic politics, and has a lot of what are perceived to be very strong allies within the establishment Democratic Party. He was out with New York State Attorney General Tish James canvassing within the district just yesterday. And, she's a very popular figure within the party. He had some, what are, I think, thought of as being influential endorsements from people who have been working within the party, Public Advocate Shimani Williams, several of the local city council members, and several local unions where, again, I think there are going to be some real questions here. DC 37, Hotel Gaming and Trades Council, with all of these organizations behind him, what has that organizing amounted to within those groups? And I think what the results here are showing is that, while some of these organizations and some of these individuals were able to achieve their electoral victories and some of their policy wins, because of some organizing, that at this point, the energy is within this DSA movement, and they have really built a more robust organization engaging a much broader slice of the electorate to get involved in these issues. And that, in some case, these endorsements are more just kind of, rubber stamps without a lot going behind them. And so I think that's part of what we saw here. If you looked at all the people who had lined up behind Reynoso, you would have assumed that that would have brought a lot of weight to bear behind the campaign. But, I can tell you, having been out, watching the Valdez campaign out there canvassing throughout the weekend, knocking on doors, and sort of the way that this movement was spread out across the city, the sense that people who were invested in the success of this DSA movement, regardless of whether or not they lived within this particular district, were working for this campaign. I think that's where you start to see things really change. And one of the things that, people, supporters of hers in this movement were saying to me last night was, there was some questions after Mamdani's victory in 2025 about whether it was just kind of a blip. Was it just this individual, this charismatic leader who was able to excite and energize voters and, turn out the new voters and turn out the young voters? And part of what I think they feel some validation in is saying that it wasn't just this one individual, that it's a larger movement, and that it's about the issues that they care about.
And we have a text that kind of backs that up from a voter in that district. And listeners, our phones and text message thread are open for your questions as we try to look at the results from the New York primaries as closely as we can. 212-433 WNYC with Michael Lange and Brigid Bergin, 212-433-9692 if you want to call or text with a question. So this voter in that Valdez-Reynoso district writes, Reynoso is a hugely popular council member for District 30 before becoming borough president. I'm in Ridgewood. I voted for Claire, but I thought Reynoso would take it. However, I have been canvassed relentlessly by the DSA for months, right up until Election Day, whereas Reynoso's campaign texted me twice, 2 days before primary day. And Brigid, that goes right to what you were just saying, right?
Exactly. I mean, it was fascinating. I went to, and I'm sure Michael was there as well, there was a Get Out the Vote rally last week in Brooklyn at the King's Theater, headlined by Mayor Mamdani and Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, where they had the entire slate of state legislative and congressional candidates that the DSA was backing. And one of the things that they did was they were essentially recruiting people there to sign up for more canvas shifts. And then, they had sort of a clever device that was part of the program where, they would put a QR code on the screen and people could sign up on the spot, and they wanted 200 people to sign up for shifts. And, throughout the event, they saw, more and more people, as people got more and more energized by the speakers, sign up. That kind of organizing translates to, there's so many more contacts with voters. And when you have that kind of contact, as compared to what we saw, for example, in New York 12, where, when I spoke to voters there, they were exhausted by this election because of the amount of mail they were getting. It's a big difference when a person comes to your door and engages in a conversation and listens to your concerns, as opposed to a mailer telling you to do something because they've decided what you should be concerned about.
Michael, you wanted to get in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Brigid outlined it super well. I mean, you could organizers, they call that, the quote unquote DSA difference. I remember speaking last year to Michael Lange after Zohran Mamdani won. Of course, Michael Lange is now the congressperson for the 12th district. And he said, you can never underestimate the power of just having, like, even one person who knows the issues really well, knows the candidates' talking points, can persuade a lot of voters. And he was like, Mamdani had folks like that on every street corner in the city going into that election. And Claire Valdez did too, and all these other candidates did. And not only were they convincing voters at poll sites, knocking on their doors over and over and over again, the level of outreach is like simply remarkable. I forget how many doors they knocked, but I think it was over 300,000. Like, it's basically they knocked all of like the Democratic primary voters in the district, and I'm sure they targeted heavily to voters under 50, things like that. But just the routine engagement, and because so many people feel like they're kind of a part of this and that they're willing to not just like volunteer money, right, but like their time over and over and over again. And I think as like social fabric and civic institutions have kind of declined or atrophied, I think this is like to some degree has been a real antidote to that, particularly politically.
Yeah. And here's a text, interestingly, from a voter over 50, and they don't say what race they voted in, but they clearly voted for the more left candidate. They wrote, just want to make the point that when speaking of the over 50 vote, we are the ones who've been voting for the lesser of two evils for decades, almost every election. Finally, in the past year or so, we have brave, strong, articulate candidates who we actually want to vote for, writes that, one over 50 voter. Michael, here's an interesting text. Can the guests speak to the impact of the Knicks win on the election? Listen, and you're laughing, but there's a political analysis here. It seems like the win really boosted Mamdani's standing in the city and thus boosted his ability to support his candidates. Ironic, given Dolan's politics, the conservative owner of the Knicks. This is something me and my friends here in New York 13 have been thinking about since the mayor joined Debralee at a Game 1 watch party in Washington Heights. You think?
That's very interesting. I'm not sure if I can provide a super comprehensive take on that. What I will say, though, is that I do think Knicks mania and everything was taking a lot of attention to some extent away from these primary elections. And I don't think it's any coincidence that basically after they win the championship, they have the parade. Young voter turnout that Thursday onward ticked up dramatically across every single district, and it carried like a tsunami into election day. So I think the Knicks play a role in this. I don't know if it's because, Zohran Mamdani was popular. He gave a phenomenal speech at the thing.
Well, I think that's what the listener is referring to, right? That speech was really good, and Dolan's speech was like angry at Mamdani for giving a good speech at the Knicks. It was so kind of right-wing grievance.
It was tough. Yeah, so I'm not sure.
And a lot of people saw that. Right.
So I don't, I think it would be hard to gauge if it was downstream of that, but I do know that from Thursday onward, the turnout, purely from like an age perspective, which again is kind of one of the most important variables in this, it was Mamdani-esque age numbers in the 7th district for sure, and like they were approaching it in the 13th. And Debralee won the early vote, but she really won the election because she carried election day, which was not a foregone conclusion either.
Fanny in Brooklyn, you're on WNYC. Oh, Fanny, hang on. Brigid, what do you want to say?
Well, I would just add to that, my colleague Joe Hong and I did an analysis after the first 4 days of early voting. And, it was striking that it was significantly lower turnout compared to last year, which is to be expected, when the most exciting race that's on every Democrat's ballot is the state comptroller's race. It's not exactly going to juice up turnout in the same way as the mayoral race did last year. But the age of the turnout and where voters were turning out more and less was very interesting, because we did see lower turnout in the 7th Congressional District in those early days of early voting. Whether that was a direct result of Knicks mania, I think that certainly there was some Knicks distraction going on that first weekend for sure. And whether or not Mamdani gave it a boost, I think if nothing else, once voters got past the playoffs and the celebrations and the parade down the Canyon of Heroes, that people could then at least refocus. So even for those for whom it wasn't an all-consuming event like it was for people like me, it then did give people a chance to then redirect.
Now let's go to Fanny in Brooklyn, who voted in the Brad Lander, Dan Goldman contest that Lander won. Fanny, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for having me on the radio. So I just wish you all were talking a little bit about the number of voters who participated, because with percentages, it's always a little bit misleading, the size of wins and all of that. But also, as far as the percentage of all voters are concerned in New York, in New York City, and New York State, and at large in the country, because I feel like sometimes these contests, we start drawing conclusions about the future of the Democratic Party and what their best way forward is. I personally voted for Mamdani, but I voted against Lander because I had an actual personal reason. He was my council member, and I didn't like certain things that he did. So for me, that was much more important than the fact that he called Gaza a genocide, which I may agree with, but that, as far as I could tell, was the only difference literally between what he and Goldman were saying. So I just want you guys to put it in kind of a larger context and draw conclusions from that.
Fanny, thank you very much. And I think we're going to have Brad Lander for a couple of minutes of a victory lap in a few minutes. But Brigid, interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, there is a broader context here. I mean, another piece of reaction that I am hearing, particularly from folks who are watching these results and perhaps are not happy with these results, is the sense of who couldn't participate. And so the push for open primaries, which, would be something that would be at a municipal level, not at a state and federal. But, that conversation, I think proponents of that are going to seize on the results of this race. But there are lots of factors that, that inspire people to turn out or not turn out, and that can determine how they decide who to support in these races.
We're going to take a short break, and then we have two of the winners who accepted our invitation to check in for a few minutes. Claire Valdez is on the line. We're going to have Brad Lander for a couple of minutes. We're also expecting to bring in Debralee Santos from the Manhattan Times and the Bronx Free Press, who reports specifically on the Espaillat, Daria-Lisa Chevalier district. So we'll continue with this coverage of the New York primaries with Michael Lange and Brigid Bergin and you. Stay with us. Brian Lehrer on WNYC as we continue to break down last night's New York primary results with WNYC and Gothamist senior political reporter Brigid Bergin and Michael Lange, a New York City-based writer, researcher, strategist, and political organizer, and such a kind of deep, granular investigator of New York City electoral politics. His Substack headline on his newsletter yesterday was "Predicting Every Block in New York's 3 closest congressional races," and we're comparing how that turned out to what he predicted. With us now for just a few minutes, probably pretty sleepless, is the winner of that primary in the 7th Congressional District in Brooklyn and Queens to succeed Nydia Velasquez, who's retiring. It is Claire Valdez. Ms. Valdez, thank you for giving us a few minutes this morning. Welcome back to WNYC.
Thank you so much for having me, Brian. It's great to be here.
All right. How late were you up last night?
I'm not entirely sure. I want to say maybe 3 o'clock.
Well, thanks for, on somewhat lack of sleep, joining us for a few. Why do you think you won by this much, 20 points?
I think people are really hungry for change in New York, and we saw that across a bunch of different races. The movement that elected Zohran Mamdani it remains very strong, and we're going to keep building. I'm really, really thrilled. We ran a campaign that knocked almost every single door in New York 7, 300,000 doors in total, and 4,000 volunteers. That was the margin of victory.
And so you must think that shows a lot about the influence of Mayor Mamdani himself, as well as the DSA, their ability to organize. Because many analysts are saying you wouldn't have won without the mayor. He really put your name on the map by endorsing you. A lot of people in the district may not have heard that much about you. Agree?
I think the mayor came out of the movement that he and I and thousands of New Yorkers have been building for years. I've been a member of DSA since 2019. I personally onboarded hundreds of people in my time in leadership. And we've been building this movement for a long time. And I think last night's victory and last year's victory are really testament to incredible organizing that so many people have poured their lives into to talk about the future that we deserve. Medicare for all, housing for all, unions for all. Fighting the establishment and winning a world of true international solidarity and cooperation. And I think that's the message that really resounds at the doors.
The Mamdani agenda at the city level begins with universal child care. You just cited housing for all, Medicare for all. Are those the national DSA-related agenda items that you think you could bring to Congress or add to in Congress? Because obviously they talk about those things there already. But as opposed to child care?
I'm supportive of a bunch of different universal programs, and I think the affordability crisis in New York is the same one that's facing so many working class people across the country. So we're going to be focused on a lot of different things, but I'm really proud to have been a union organizer before my political life. It's what got me into politics. I'm going to be really focused on things like the PRO Act, on building the labor movement and getting as many working people as possible into unions, because that's how we take on these bad bosses and billionaires.
What do you think, and this will be the last question, I'll let you go, what do you think will be the biggest difference that your new House colleagues will experience between you and the retiring member, Nydia Velázquez, if any?
I'm really it's incredibly big shoes to fill in this district. We've had a true working class champion for immigrant communities, for Puerto Rico, and I really aspire to continue that legacy, and to continue a legacy of anti-colonial, solidarity, international solidarity, fighting against the genocide in Gaza and against forever wars, and just building on the legacy that the Congresswoman has already built for so long.
So, quick follow-up: how much do you think Gaza was a reason or the reason that you beat Reynoso? I know in one of the televised debates that I saw, you accused him of only calling it a genocide in Gaza once he got into the race. How much do you think Gaza was a factor?
I think it was a big factor. This was something that people talked about on the doors quite a bit. People want to see real consistency and moral clarity from their leadership. And I think especially, after the United States launched this illegal war on Iran, there's just a real deep understanding of how intricately, entangled our foreign policy and domestic policy is. And people are outraged by seeing 75,000 people murdered, millions displaced. And we don't want to see our taxpayer dollars going to funding a genocide and displacement, apartheid. We're sick of it. And so I think that was really something that motivated people at the doors. And I'm really excited that we've elected a bunch of candidates now who are going to go to Congress and fight to make sure that we're not, the United States is not funding a genocide.
Clara Valdez, the winner in the 7th Congressional District to succeed the retiring Nydia Velázquez. Thank you for a few minutes this morning. We look forward to having you on many times when you're in office.
Thank you so much, Brian. Have a good day.
And of course, we don't technically call her Congress member-elect, but in that district, the primary is the election, as no doubt in the 10th Congressional District, where Brad Lander won by more than 30 points over the incumbent Dan Goldman last night. And Brad Lander, the former council member, former New York City comptroller, joins us now for a few minutes from him. Mr. Lander, welcome back to WNYC and congratulations.
Good morning, Brian. Thank you. Great to be on with you as always.
Same first question I just asked Ms. Valdez. Why do you think you won by that much?
I think voters, and this is true all across the country, are fed up with the status quo that's not working. They don't see Democrats fighting hard enough, not only against Trump, but against a rigged system that keeps driving up prices and not wages. They want to see folks who are really fighting for something bolder, something different. I do also think in New York City, the hopeful energy that's moving, it's partly from Mayor Mamdani and his win a year ago. There's partly from the Knicks and their win a couple weeks ago. There's something moving here that is putting hope against fear and corruption. And we ran a campaign trying to channel that with a like Mr. Rogers vibe, but a fighter's energy, and people really responded to it.
Do you think Dan Goldman represented fear and corruption?
Well, the system that's a broader system. Donald Trump represents fear and corruption, and the whole Democratic Party knows we have to fight that, but it really is a question of how. How are you showing that you're out on the streets fighting for working people, putting your body on the line, organizing together with your neighbors, not taking corporate PAC money? I really do think candidates that take money from Wall Street and crypto and AI and APAC, like voters have had it with that. And running a race that just draws clear lines so that we can stand up and fight that corruption and fear matters a lot.
How much do you think voter concern over Gaza was the reason for your win? We just heard what Claire Valdez said about that and her race. Your race was so widely portrayed as two liberal Zionists running against each other, but he would not depart from his support for sending military aid to Israel, or was late to being as critical, whether you use the word genocide or not, some people do, some people don't, was not critical enough, early enough over what Israel was doing there. How much is that the reason that the two of you won, if you agree on almost everything else?
I mean, this was a significant difference in our race. Representative Goldman, voted for every standalone military aid package to Israel. Doesn't consider it a genocide, doesn't insist on accountability. I think Democratic voters are saying very clearly, we don't want to pay for any more of Netanyahu's wars, and we need some reckoning. President Biden's strategy to hug Bibi was a catastrophic failure for Palestinians, for Israelis, for American credibility in the world, and for the Democratic Party. And we got to look at it squarely. So I'm going to go be one of the Jewish members of Congress who's boldest in support of Palestinian human rights and freedom, and also one of the members of Congress who stands up strongest against anti-Semitism and hatred of Jews. To me, it seems pretty clear those aren't two separate jobs. Those are the same job.
Any other way that you would think that you would be the most different from Dan Goldman as you take that seat from him?
Well, first, I just think voters will see me out in the neighborhood, like on my city bike and at the schools. I love representing my neighbors, and I think people can really count on seeing me out there, as they have for a long time. A lot of the bills that passed in the council, making us the first city in the country that has fair schedules for fast food workers and living wages for Uber and Lyft drivers and protections for freelancers. I want to bring those things to Congress. And folks know that I'll be out there, putting my body on the line. Actually, I'm just coming to you outside of 26 Federal Plaza, where I did my weekly court watching shift. I will make sure to keep the triage center that Rep. Dan Goldman has set up to protect our immigrant neighbors, and I'll also keep organizing together with people and putting our bodies on the line. We got a fascist in the White House and ICE agents out in our streets. Like, it's time for folks to organize together with a hopeful spirit, but also with steel spines.
All right, Brad Lander, we look forward to speaking to you many times once you're in office, as I said to Claire Valdez, and as we invite always various members of the local congressional delegation. Thank you for a few minutes this morning.
Thank you, Brian. I'll come on anytime you invite me. Love talking to you and your listeners.
Thank you. And we continue with WNYC's Brigid Bergin and Michael Lange, New York City-based writer, researcher, strategist, political organizer, and deep diver on New York electoral politics. And now we'll add Debralee Santos to the conversation. She is editor of the Manhattan Times and the Bronx Free Press, two of the local news outlets on the ground in the 13th District in Upper Manhattan and the nearby Bronx, where probably the biggest upset of the night took place. Daria-Liza Avila-Chevalier over Adriano Espaillat. Debralee, welcome back to WNYC.
Good morning.
This one was much closer, just a few percentage points, but a year ago nobody knew Daria-Liza Avila-Chevalier. Why'd she win?
I think you're looking at, to start, what everyone has spoken of in terms of, in the broadest possible terms, seismic. This is remarkable and an extraordinary moment and all the rest. I think it's fitting. And I think you're looking at an instance where this race is, as you noted, the tightest of the group, and speaks to her ability and the larger coalition around her to tap into the level of restive sense that things were not quite right. And as she noted a number of times in public appearances and on the stump and in a community forum that was held by largely by Dominican women who organized a community forum that she attended with Oscar Romero, another challenger, she spoke very plainly about, are you better off? Are you better off now than 9 years ago? When the incumbent was first elected. And so I think that being able to mine that level of discontent deeply, also with the canvassing prowess that was spoken of in the earlier conversations, twinned together, made for a compelling argument, and then bore the results that we see last night.
Here's a text from a listener, Debralee, that says, regarding Chevalier. So she won with white college-educated voters in Harlem, Washington Heights, Hudson Heights, Inwood. That's a BFD, big something deal, for the Harlem political world. Do you ever thought about that?
Many. Right, and we're still, and to be fair, we're still sorting it all out. I've had, conversations that, began in the late evening yesterday and continued early into the morning today, and still, it is a big deal, and because of what was once a traditional voting bloc between black and brown voters, between the coalition that brought David Dinkins to City Hall to power in instances where these communities had not been able to forge electoral power on their own, but could find consensus and therefore could find the ability to pull votes together to bring together winning blocs across the city. This calls that into question, and I think that's been something that has been a seismic struggle along the intra-family conversations. What does this look like for us? And so I want to be clear too. I'd be remiss if noting this electoral win on the part of Daria-Liza. There is something to be said for, as you noted, she was not that well known in the district. She had been an organizer and done the work that she has touted along the way, but this is not someone that folks knew because of connections along the way on civic projects or electoral work or years perhaps spent doing the kinds of things that folks do to get on people's radar. And so people are learning a lot about this new person that has come into the district, that was touted by Mamdani late in the game, and they're all there are a lot of heads on swivels. And so they're not necessarily those easy connections where you go, oh, I remember she campaigned for, say, Letitia James, right, a well-known individual in the district, and then you can sort of make that connective tissue starts to resonate. That's not happening here. So people are, in fact, scratching their heads and saying, both on the sort of in the political circles, but also on the ground, where can I be a part of this, or where would I naturally be a part of this? And I think that happened in the wake also of the Mamdani moment when he was elected into office, or seemed to be sort of on that track as momentum gained around him. This conversation around, okay, well, not just because I'm interested in sort of being self-serving and wanting to have political capital, but like who do I know that I can connect to or speak with about him and perhaps be a part of this, or just learn more about whether I want to be. And I think that's happening now as well, and it's causing for sort of new alliances and new questions to be raised at the same time.
Michael Lange, you want to get in here with Debralee?
Yeah,
in your predictions newsletter on Monday, you wrote, a month ago, I thought Darya-Eliza was on track for an epic upset, but you then thought that Espaillat made a comeback, and your prediction was Espaillat 52%, Avila Chevalier 48%. It wound up pretty much the opposite, just a few points between them, but she won instead of he won. So what happened, and your follow-up on anything that Debralee said there?
Yeah, I mean, my idea was that this was a great sleeping giant campaign, that Adriano Espaillat was a little more vulnerable than public perception was, and that again, like a very well-funded, momentum-driven challenge could surprise him. There was so much money poured in over the last month that I thought that, particularly kind of, again, when you have like a first-time candidate who's not Mamdani-esque in terms of like getting all this earned media attention, all this inoculation, things like that, I thought the negative spending would be able to define her far more than it ended up doing, particularly, again, with older voters. And I mean, yes, well, a big story of this election is like, yes, she did do well with younger, middle-aged, older, white college-educated voters in Morningside Heights, Hudson Heights, and Inwood. She doesn't win this race. I mean, she's up 2,300 votes now. She doesn't win this race without winning Harlem. And this is not, she didn't just win that Frederick Douglass corridor south of 125th Street with the Levain Bakery, the Chase Bank, the luxury buildings, the Douglass Element. I mean, she's winning precincts. I have the map right in front of me. Really, I mean, as far north as like 155th Street. Espaillat, for a Democratic incumbent of 10 years, and this was always kind of why I thought that he was quite vulnerable, was for a Democratic incumbent of 10 years, his standing with black voters was quite poor. And some of that, again, is due to the Rangel-Keith-Wright wars from 10 plus years ago, but also he had then 10 years as a congressperson to build up his standing amongst those really important constituencies. And I mean, again, it appears that he did a very poor job of that, because someone who has built a political machine for 30 years lost to someone who was 32 years old. And again, like,
so to be really clear to what you were just saying, and in case the previous listener's text confused people about what happened in Harlem, she won the majority of the black vote, correct?
I mean, I will dig into the voter file, but from just my read of all the precinct analysis, yes. And I think that she did quite well with younger black voters in particular, very similar to Mamdani. I mean, the Mamdani story in New York 13 had a lot to do with younger Hispanic voters and younger black voters. Adriano, I think, overall did quite well among Hispanic voters, young and old, but she had a Mamdani-like performance with younger black voters. Yeah. And that, I think, swung this race. I mean, the margin was so thin. Yeah. And also, and to kind of follow up on that, again, I thought that there would be, again, this spending would really hurt her with older voters of color and even older white Jewish voters in particular. And it didn't really seem to make a dent, I mean, she got 49% and sorry, go ahead.
Debralee, go ahead.
No, I think there's a lot to look at here, and as you say, Michael, there's a lot to peruse in terms of some of the returns. But the fact is that Adriano Espaillat defeated he ran against what was black establishment Democrats in Harlem in order to gain the seat, right, a number of times. And enmity was created, and there were instances where alliances were forged and perhaps cratered in ways that were less public, but it's not as if this was a very, very strong black-brown ticket. This is not as if the cavalry came in and somehow, would help catapult him into space. He relied heavily on his base, on the usual levers of turnout, which have, in fact, been successful for him in the past. But this was not some sort of turning point, again, back to, not to hearken back to Bill Lynch and those moments, but it is fitting here to at least bring up the comparison. This was not that. And so I think what is also stunning, and it would need to be a part of this cornerstone of this conversation, is that for many Hispanic voters, and when we say Hispanic, we're talking about a Dominican American a titan. We're talking about the Dominican community. There are many who are finding themselves shook, as it were, at the notion that he was, sort of an establishment Democrat, or that he was, that they are, by definition or extension, in having voted for him and supported him, that that they are part of that sort of establishment. In part because he's been in office for, yes, a decade, and certainly longer than that in terms of the longer electoral history in the district in northern Manhattan. But that, we've had this conversation writ large across the city, state, and even the country, that in order to succeed in Congress, seniority matters. You need to build up the years. You need to put in the time, etc. And so this idea that, 9 years in, he's become the dean of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, that he's sort of leaning into those moments where power is, in fact, yes, being accumulated. And you can argue that that system is, in fact, broken and perhaps even unethical and wrong, but that is sort of the way forward. And so many an individual, many a voter, or many a resident is finding, and again, I'm speaking specifically of those that have seen in him leadership on the Latino side, finding that, wait a minute, we did this wrong, and so I'm not suggesting that there were not missteps from the campaign perspective, but fundamentally there are also, I think, imaginative leaps that are being questioned as well, and saying, well, does that mean then that, this entire way of how we have to sort of invest, right, in our candidates and begin to help build them up? And that speaks also something that I've mentioned that I believe must be discussed, is that there is a bench, right? There is this manifest level of robust talent uptown that is generationally young, and while they may have, in some instances, they've been described as part of a squadriano because of their allegiance to Adriano Espaillat as his own veritable kingmaker, if you will, but that there has been this building up of strong, young talent that may not be necessarily the most leftist, although some of them would argue individually that they are, but you have a number of young Afro-Latina women as well who are in electoral office or in spaces where they command that level of influence or working towards those projects. And you find that there are a lot of question marks there, and there's, why would there not be an opportunity for anyone who's seeking to recruit talent to not look at these candidates and say, you've done the work. Even for that matter, some of the folks that lined up with Daria Lisa, Robert Jackson, among them, right, who's also been in electoral politics for some time, has also had and has a robust level of talent around him. And so if that felt like the right level of allegiance, were there not individuals within that sphere that have done work within the community and speak to allegiances and conversations? And I remember 10 years ago when we did that, was there no one sort of on the landscape that would fit the bill? And those are conversations folks are having and saying, we are all about young talent. We're all about sort of perhaps new blood and changing things up. Was there no one uptown that fit the bill, that's been doing the work? Did no one, sort of level up enough for them to be considered? Because that's not what happened here.
Debralee Santos, editor of the Manhattan Times and the Bronx Free Press, thanks for giving us a few minutes. Before we run out of time, Brigid, I want to touch on two other races that we covered extensively here on the show that we haven't talked about at all yet. And that is in New York 17, where, of course, the Democrats are going to try to unseat Mike Lawler. In the fall, north of the city, Kate Conley won in that district. She's going to join us tomorrow among our guests when we look more closely at races in the New York area where November is going to matter, because we're talking primarily today about races where the primary really was the election because they are that safe Democratic district. And the other one where there was no DSA candidate in the maybe slightly more conservative 12th Congressional District in Manhattan, where Congressman Jerry Nadler is retiring. Michael Lange won that. I think we can say there were at least two, maybe three more progressive candidates than him in the race, if we're looking at this right-to-left spectrum. Probably Jack Schlossberg, Nina Schwalbe, and Alex Boris. But Michael Lange, who was endorsed more by the Democratic establishment folks. Governor Hochul, I think, was at his victory party last night. Correct me if I'm wrong. Yep. Jerry Nadler himself endorsed Lange to succeed him. Michael Bloomberg had endorsed him and thrown money in his race. Michael Lange won. So was New York 12 different?
I mean, in some ways, well, yeah, it was different. And I think that's part of the reason why Mayor Mamdani did not endorse a candidate in this race. None of the candidates running really fit the movement that he is part of and that he's building. There is the context here that, the Democratic Party is a Big Tent party. And, this is a district that is certainly much older than much of the rest of the city. When you look at the voter turnout there, it trended much older than, somewhere like New York 7, for example, and has therefore is going to appeal to different candidates. I think part of what we're seeing here is in order for the Democrats to be successful in, for example, taking back the House, that they are going to need to find the candidates that fit certain districts. Would a DSA candidate have been as successful in New York 12? I'm not sure. I think it's less likely. Mm-hmm. And in a district like New York 17, certainly that's where you see more of like the Pat Ryan movement being effective. That's a neighboring congressional district, of course, but someone who has been able to appeal in a bipartisan fashion, and yet also, have alliances with AOC when he needs to. And, right. Seeing the military experience that Kay Conley's bringing and that kind of background, when she takes on someone like a Mike Lawler, who himself, was just on Morning Edition today talking about his ability to be bipartisan and work across the aisle and call out the president when he needs to, a lot of attention is going to turn to a race like that. Huge amounts of money are going to pour into it. And we're going to see the way that Democrats need to appeal to their voters based on, where they are. It is part of this movement.
And Michael Lange, 30 seconds for a last thought from you related to that. How much do you think this DSA sweep of, the races in which Mamdani endorsed for Congress, plus, as I mentioned way back at the beginning of the segment, 7 of the 8 New York State Assembly races that there were DSA candidates in. How much do you think it either generalizes to any of the rest of the country or serves as a point of attack for Republicans, like, oh, if this sort of moderate Democrat gets into office, they're going to be drawn all the way to the left by the new power of the Mamdani wing of the Democratic Party, the AOC wing of the Democratic Party, which is further empowered. I'm curious where you think that goes between now and November, then we're out of time.
Yeah, I feel like they've been calling the Democrats socialists for a while, so I try not to lend too much credence to that.
You mean like 100 years?
Yeah, it's been a long time. I do think, though, that that there are many pieces of this that you can import other places. I think, look, the Democratic Party broadly is becoming younger, becoming more college educated. It's becoming more, and it's become increasingly like kind of squeezed in that like precarious middle class. Like more people are confined to the renter class now, things like that. I mean, there's broader like anti-system disillusionment that I think just goes beyond our 5 boroughs. So it might look different, but I think also like the way in which Mamdani and these DSA candidates communicate publicly, but also like the field aspect of the campaign, the door knocking, the civic institution building, the community building. I do think that it will replicate. I mean, it's This is kind of like a core theme of my book. And Brian, forgive me. We're talking about all the predictions where my margins were wrong.
Mention
New
your
York
book.
12. New York 12.
New York 12. You got it
Lasher
right.
Plus, there we go. I said Lasher plus 81 by 4. But still, but even in New York 12, though, we're talking about institutions and the death of institutions. Lasher again was supported by Nadler on the west side, things like that. Sometimes in the past the race would polarize a lot, west versus east. Lasher won the west side, but not by a lot. But he did quite well on the east side, particularly in older, more Jewish precincts, things like that. The west east depolarized, and like Alex Boris did well with younger voters, things like that. But that election also did not cut so cleanly, and I think we're just in an era now where the political institutions that have long governed the city are weaker, and these candidates and coalitions are going to have to adapt.
What's the title of your book again?
Untitled, so far.
Oh, you're working on it. Okay.
Yeah, still working.
Listeners, what you can read of Michael Lange's is his Substack newsletter, which is called The Narrative Wars. And as for Brigid Bergin, well, her platforms, as you may know, are WNYC and Gothamist. Thanks both.
Thank you, Brian.
So great to be here. Thank you.